This is the United States in 2025. The U.S. still leads the world economically with a GDP, the total value of goods and services, ranging from $28 to $30 trillion. It's the birthplace of the iPhone, Tesla cars, Coca-Cola, and a host of things the world adores. Population: 340 million people. Leading companies like Apple and Google, along with the massive financial industry on Wall Street, are proof of America's strength. To compare America's economic power, let's take a broader look at the world. The total global GDP in 2025, according to IMF projections, is expected to be around $110 to $115 trillion. This means that the U.S. economy accounts for about 25 to 26% of the world's GDP. Simply put, for every $4 created globally, more than one comes from America. That's an impressive figure, especially when you realize the U.S. population is just 340 million people, only about 4% of the global population, which stands at around 8.1 billion. With less than 1/20th of the world's population, the U.S. generates 1/4 of the global economic output. It shows just how overwhelmingly powerful their economic capability is. Compared to history, this ratio has declined slightly. Back in the 1950s, after World War II, the U.S. once accounted for nearly 40% of global GDP because many other nations had been devastated by war. But as Europe, Japan, and especially China rose, America's share shrank. Still, 25% is a dominating figure, maintaining their #1 position. Altogether, the next 10 largest economies outside of the U.S., such as China, Japan, Germany, India, France, the UK, and so on, have a combined GDP of about $50 trillion. That's only double that of the US, even though their combined population is 3.5 billion, 10 times that of America. But then comes a number that shocks everyone. The US national debt has surpassed $36.22 trillion, the largest on the planet. How can the richest country also be the most indebted? So what exactly is national debt that has everyone talking? National debt may sound complicated and huge, but really, it's easier to understand if you shrink the scale and use some everyday examples. It's like when you borrow money in daily life. Public debt is basically the same, except the borrower isn't you or me. It's the government of a country. And the amount involved isn't tens of millions, but trillions of dollars. More specifically, national debt is all the money a government borrows to cover expenses when tax revenue falls short. In the U.S., every year they collect taxes from citizens, from individuals, corporations, and sales taxes. But the money usually only covers part of what's needed, because they have a lot to spend on. They spend on building highways, paying salaries for doctors in public hospitals, buying fighter jets for the military, and even giving out stimulus payments when crises hit. When tax revenues can't cover spending, the government issues treasury bonds. Here's a simple example. In 2024, the U.S. collected about $4 trillion in taxes from individuals and businesses. But in the same year, they spent $6 trillion on everything from defense to schools to unemployment support. That left a $2 trillion gap. They couldn't just wait to save up the money, so they borrowed more by selling bonds. This borrowing has accumulated over decades, through wars, financial crises, and pandemics, ultimately reaching $36.22 trillion today. It's simple. Public debt is like a household taking out loans. And in America's case, that household has 340 million members. Their spending needs are unlimited, so their borrowing is bigger than any other nation's. And here's the fun fact. The U.S. is the world's #1 economy. #1 when it comes to borrowing money. They spend massively to maintain their #1 position, and when they don't have enough money, they have no hesitation about borrowing. For example, in 2020 when the pandemic hit, causing millions to lose their jobs and businesses to shut down, the U.S. didn't let everything collapse. They rolled out relief packages totaling more than $5 trillion. That included direct cash payments to citizens, business support, and funding for vaccines. This money wasn't available in the Treasury, so they borrowed it. They pushed the national debt from $27 trillion in 2020 to over $36 trillion in just 5 years. The military is another major reason for America's heavy borrowing. They are not only powerful domestically, but also a global military superpower. The US maintains over 800 military bases in 70 countries. Japan, Germany, the Middle East, you name it. In 2024, their defense budget is nearly $900 billion. This money goes to buying aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and supporting allies like Ukraine, for instance. But tax revenues are still not enough to cover expenses. So they borrow to maintain their role as the world's policeman. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone consumed more than $2 trillion, and once again, most of it was financed through debt. Another important factor is the US dollar. It's not just America's currency, it's the world's currency. When Saudi Arabia sells oil, they get paid in US dollars. When South Korea sells Samsung phones, they also take US dollars. Because the dollar is trusted, the US can easily issue treasury bonds at low interest rates, usually just 2% to 4%. Other countries like Argentina or Sudan have to borrow at 15% to 20% interest, so they can't afford to rack up too much debt without risking bankruptcy. But the US is different. They can borrow trillions without paying much in interest, and that's how they keep their superpower status. So who does America owe the $36.22 trillion to? It's not like you owe me some money and if you don't pay, the bank will seize your house. For the US, national debt is a strange financial game, both smart and risky. Let's break down exactly who America owes the $36.22 trillion in debt. Most of it, about 70%, or roughly $25 trillion, is owed to Americans themselves. Sounds weird, right? Because a huge portion of the debt is held by the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed. You might have heard this name in the news from time to time. The U.S. Central Bank holds about $6 to $7 trillion in Treasury bonds. The Fed buys this debt to pump money into the economy during crises like the 2008 meltdown or the 2020 pandemic. In simple terms, America owes itself. It's a complicated mechanism because the Fed is not the government. It's an independent entity. But it helps America control its money supply. Another chunk is held by the Social Security Trust Fund, about $2.8 trillion. That's retirement money collected through taxes, but the government temporarily borrows it to cover expenses and promises to pay it back when people retire. In addition, major banks like J.P. Chase, private investment funds, and individual Americans also hold between $10 and $12 trillion in Treasury bonds. In addition, major banks like J.P. Chase, private investment funds, and individual Americans also hold between $10 and $12 trillion in Treasury bonds. They like these bonds because they're safe and offer steady returns, like a savings account. But essentially, it's a loan to the government, and the U.S. is borrowing that money. The rest, 30% or between $10 and $11 trillion, is foreign debt. And do you know who America's biggest foreign creditor is? It's Japan, holding about $1.3 trillion. Japan earns dollars by exporting Toyotas, Sonys, and then invests in U.S. bonds to keep their money safe. Next up is China with about $1 trillion. Previously, China held $1.3 trillion, but has been reducing its holdings due to trade tensions with the U.S. and efforts to diversify their assets. China buys U.S. debt to manage the massive influx of dollars from exporting goods to America. Other countries like the UK, Ireland, Caribbean nations, and Saudi Arabia also contribute a few trillion dollars through investment funds or oil sales. These countries are not just creditors, they are also partners in the global financial system led by the U.S. So what's the real nature of this situation? America's debt isn't the burden we often imagine. It's a form of strength. U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest assets in the world. When the global economy wobbles, like during the 2008 crisis or the 2020 pandemic, people flock to U.S. bonds to protect their money instead of gold or the euro. Thus, America's debt grows. Debt becomes a source of strength because it's backed by the global belief that the U.S. will never default. The dollar remains the king of currencies, and America is the world's largest economy, so the world needs it to stay stable. In short, America's national debt is a financial circle based on trust and power. They mainly owe themselves, but also owe the world a part. Debt doesn't weaken them. It fuels their spending to keep their number one status. But if that trust ever wavers, the game could change. So, is America worried about repaying its debt? With $36.22 trillion in national debt, is the US concerned? The answer is not really. They care, but not in a panicked way like small countries drowning in debt. Every year, America has to pay interest to bondholders. For instance, in 2024, interest payments are around $800 billion. Sounds huge, but with the US's massive GDP and over $4 trillion collected in taxes yearly, they can handle it. And the key point is, America isn't at risk of defaulting like other countries. If Argentina can't pay its foreign debt, it gets sued, loses funding, and its economy collapses. But the US is different. Over 70% of its debt is internal, owed to the Fed, pension funds, and American banks. So if there's a problem, they can handle it in-house. More importantly, the dollar is their own currency. If necessary, the Fed can simply print more dollars to pay the debt, though they're careful not to overdo it to avoid inflation. What about other countries? Just look at Venezuela. Printing too much money led to millions of percent inflation. But America knows when to stop. And the reality is, the whole world doesn't want the US to default either. Japan, China, and major investment funds all rely on US bonds to keep their money safe. If America collapsed, the global economy would spiral into chaos. Oil wouldn't be sold, goods wouldn't be traded. So, America's debt isn't just their problem, it's the world's problem. America is like a wealthy big shot who borrows from everyone in the neighborhood but still lives large, because everyone believes he's the one keeping the peace. Having a lot of debt doesn't mean they're weak, it means they're powerful. A strange story that only America could write.